The army base at Fort Campbell buzzed with the usual noise of soldiers preparing for another training cycle. Humvees rumbled past the motor pool, dust rising in the Tennessee heat. Mechanics shouted across the open bays, wrenches clattered on steel floors, and somewhere in the distance a helicopter's blades chopped through the air like a warning. Among the noise there was one figure who didn't shout, didn't argue, didn't push herself into the crowd. Private First Class Sarah Collins worked quietly at the far end of the hangar. She was small, wiry, with grease smeared across her cheek and fingernails stained dark from oil. Most of the soldiers barely noticed her. The ones who did? They called her the quiet mechanic. To them, Sarah was just another support soldier. She fixed what broke. She kept engines humming. She carried parts no one else wanted to touch. And she did it without complaint. But the whispers traveled. She's too soft. She ain't cut out for combat. She's book smart, maybe, but not soldier smart. Some laughed outright when they saw her walking past the Apache helicopters parked on the flight line. A few of the pilots, men with square jaws and loud voices, made sure she could hear them. You can polish it, Collins, but don't dream about flying it. Bet she couldn't even reach the pedals in that cockpit. Sarah kept her head down, never answering. On the outside, she was silent. On the inside, her heart burned, because what no one knew, what she had never told them, was that Sarah had spent years studying everything she could about the Apache. Every manual, every schematic, every tiny detail about its systems. While others went out drinking, she stayed in her small barracks room tracing diagrams by the dim light of a desk lamp. She knew the engines, the rotors, the weapon systems, the avionics. She could strip one apart and put it back together blindfolded. But more than that, she dreamed of flying it. The Apache was more than a machine to Sarah. To her, it was freedom, power, a way to prove she was more than the quiet girl fixing bolts. But dreams don't mean much in the army if you're quiet, if you're overlooked, if no one believes in you. And no one believed in Sarah. Her father had worked in an auto shop back in a small Kentucky town. She had grown up with the smell of gasoline and steel. Other girls played with dolls. Sarah played with carburetors. But when she announced she wanted to join the army, he laughed bitterly. "Army eats kids like you alive," he said. "Stick to fixing cars. Leave the fighting to men." That memory stayed with her. Even now, years later, the echo of his doubt crawled inside her chest. One summer morning, Sarah crouched under the belly of a Black Hawk, tightening a hydraulic line when Sergeant Miller, a burly crew chief with arms like tree trunks, leaned down. "Hey, Collins," he grinned. "You ever think about doing real soldier work? Or are you just happy with your wrenches?" The men nearby chuckled. Sarah tightened the bolt until her knuckles bled but said nothing. She could feel the heat crawling up her neck. Miller smirked. "That's what I thought." He walked away, tossing a rag over his shoulder like the conversation was over. Sarah stayed under the helicopter, gripping the wrench until her hand shook. She wanted to scream, to tell him she could fly circles around any of them if they gave her the chance. But instead, she whispered only to herself, "One day." That night, after the hangar lights went dark and the soldiers drifted to their bunks, Sarah stayed behind. She slipped into the Apache's cockpit like a thief. The seat cradled her. The controls rested against her palms as if they belonged there. The smell of oil and metal filled her lungs. In the quiet, she closed her eyes. She imagined the rotors spinning above her, the ground falling away, the world opening wide beneath her boots. She imagined the night sky blazing with fire and the Apache cutting through it like a hawk. Then footsteps. "Collins," she snapped upright. It was Chief Warrant Officer Reynolds, one of the senior pilots. His flashlight beam cut through the dark and froze her in place. "What in God's name are you doing in my bird?" he barked. Sarah's throat locked. Words failed. Reynolds shook his head, half amused, half annoyed. "You think you're a pilot now? You're maintenance. That's all you'll ever be. Get out." Shame burned her as she climbed down. The other pilots heard about it the next morning, and the laughter rolled through the hangar like wildfire. She was sitting in the cockpit. Guess grease monkeys want to be warriors now. Sarah didn't argue. She didn't fight back. She just kept working, wiping, fixing, replacing. But inside, something hardened. They didn't know her. They didn't know what she was capable of. And they sure didn't know what was coming, because the war that had been a distant rumor was about to land on their doorstep. And when it did, Sarah Collins, the quiet mechanic, would get her chance. The summer heat didn't break that year. The Tennessee air sat heavy, sticky, almost choking. Soldiers trained like usual, but there was tension in every briefing room, in every officer's voice. Rumors whispered down the barracks hallways. A deployment order was coming. They weren't rumors for long. One late afternoon, the commanding officer gathered them all in the hangar. Rows of soldiers stood at attention, sweat running down their backs. The colonel's voice echoed off the steel walls. "Ladies and gentlemen, this unit has been activated. We are deploying to the Middle East. The situation is escalating. You will be in combat." The words slammed through Sarah's chest. She looked around at the other soldiers. Some grinned, hungry for action. Some swallowed hard. For her, it was both dread and hope tangled into one knot. Combat. The place where pilots proved themselves. The place where people died. Over the next few weeks, the unit prepared. Mechanics doubled their hours, working on engines until their hands cracked. Pilots sharpened their skills in endless training flights. Sarah moved through it all, silent as ever, but listening, watching, waiting. One evening, she sat alone at the edge of the flight line, the sun sinking blood red behind the Apaches. Captain Harris, one of the cocky pilots who had always mocked her, walked past with two other officers. He glanced her way and smirked. "Careful, Collins, don't get any ideas. Combat ain't for you. You're safer with a wrench." The officers laughed as they kept walking. Sarah didn't answer. She didn't need to. She just stared at the helicopter. The Apache's black frame glowed against the sunset like a shadow of power she couldn't touch. Not yet. Deployment came faster than she expected. Within days, Sarah was strapped into a transport plane, the roar of its engines filling her ears as the desert drew closer. The base they arrived at overseas was nothing like Fort Campbell. It was dust and steel and razor wire. The air carried the constant smell of smoke and oil. Soldiers moved fast, tense, always watching the horizon. Here there was no laughter about the quiet mechanic. Here everyone was too busy trying not to die. But even in a war zone, the pilots still carried their arrogance. Sarah overheard them one night in the chow hall. "She can fix a bird, I'll give her that," Captain Harris said, his voice low but sharp. "But imagine her in combat. She'd freeze. No guts in her." Reynolds snorted. "She can barely talk, let alone fight. Let her stick to nuts and bolts." They never knew she was sitting a few tables away, hands trembling as she tried not to let their words sink too deep. Still, the fire inside her grew. Then came the first attack. It was just after midnight. The base shook with the thunder of mortars. Sirens wailed. Soldiers scrambled from bunks, grabbing rifles and helmets. Sarah threw herself into the dirt as another explosion rocked the airfield. Apaches roared to life, their blades slicing the night. Crews sprinted to load weapons, mechanics diving to finish last-minute checks under fire. Sarah's heart hammered as she crawled beneath a helicopter, tightening a hydraulic line while dust rained down from the blast wave. "Collins, get clear!" a voice shouted. She ignored it. The Apache wasn't going into the air half-finished, not on her watch, not when lives depended on it. Bullets snapped across the flight line. A mechanic screamed nearby, clutching his leg. Sarah finished the job, slammed the panel shut, and leapt back as the pilot powered up. The Apache lifted, its shadow cutting across the firelit ground. As it roared into the night, Sarah collapsed against a wall, lungs heaving. She had nearly died under that bird, but she didn't regret it, because for a moment she had felt it, that pull, that hunger, not to fix the machine, to be in it, to fly it. After the attack, the pilots gathered, bragging about their kills. Harris walked past Sarah, tossing his gloves on the table. "Good. Work tightening bolts, Collins," he said, not even looking at her, "but don't think that makes you a warrior." His words cut sharper than shrapnel. That night, Sarah lay awake on her cot staring at the ceiling. The boom of distant artillery rolled across the desert. She replayed every sneer, every laugh, every moment they told her she couldn't. Her father's voice came back to her too. Leave the fighting to men. No. Something hardened inside her chest. For years she had kept her head down, waiting for respect to come, but it never would, not unless she took it. And somewhere deep down, Sarah knew the chance was coming. A storm was building. The enemy wasn't finished. And when the fight came again, someone would have to step up. And this time Sarah Collins wouldn't stay quiet. The desert night was alive with heat lightning and the low rumble of distant shelling. Sarah sat in the hangar, sleeves rolled up, hands raw from hours of repairs. The Apaches had been flying nonstop for days, strike missions, escort runs, medevac protection. Every time they returned, something was broken, and Sarah and her fellow mechanics pushed themselves to keep them flying. But the strain wasn't just on the machines. It was on people too. Sarah had seen it in the pilots' faces. Even Harris, the one who never missed a chance to mock her, looked hollow-eyed, his jaw tight. War stripped the arrogance out of a man fast, but even so, none of them looked at Sarah as anything more than the quiet mechanic. That would change, sooner than any of them imagined. It was 2 weeks into the deployment when the call came. Enemy fighters had ambushed an Army convoy 10 miles outside the wire. The ambush wasn't random, it was a trap. Trucks burned on the desert road. Soldiers were pinned down, taking heavy fire. Radio chatter crackled through the base. Convoy Alpha is in contact. Multiple casualties. Request immediate air support. Repeat, immediate air support. The colonel's voice cut across the command tent. Get 2 Apaches in the air now. Pilots sprinted for the flight line. Mechanics scrambled to load rockets, check fuel, clear the decks. Sarah worked beside them, every motion sharp, practiced. But as she glanced toward the ready line, her stomach dropped. One of the assigned pilots, Chief Warrant Officer Reynolds, was slumped against a Humvee, clutching his chest. Medics swarmed him. Heart attack. He was out. That left only one pilot for the second Apache, Captain Harris. His co-pilot's seat sat empty. "Sir," a junior officer shouted, "we only have one crew ready. We can't send the second bird with just Harris." The colonel's face twisted with anger. "We don't have a choice. Those soldiers are dying out there." Harris stormed forward. "I'll fly solo if I have to." Sarah's breath caught. This was it, the chance she had dreamed about, prayed for. Her heart pounded as she stepped forward before she could stop herself. "I'll go," she said. The words rang out like a gunshot. Everyone froze. Harris turned, eyes wide with disbelief, then laughter. "You?" he barked. "You don't even belong in the cockpit, Collins. You're a mechanic. You'd freeze the second we took fire." "I know this bird better than anyone," Sarah said, her voice steady, louder now. "I've studied every system, every weapon. I can run the co-pilot's seat." The hangar went dead silent. The only sound was the thrum of the other Apache powering up. The colonel looked at her, searching her face. He saw no fear, only resolve. Finally, he nodded once. "Get in the seat, Collins." Harris's jaw dropped. "Sir, this is insane." "Do it," the colonel barked. "That convoy doesn't have time for your pride." Sarah's legs shook as she climbed into the cockpit. The Apache loomed over her, monstrous and alive, its rotor blades chopping the hot night air. She slid into the seat, strapped in, and wrapped her hands around the controls she had touched only in secret. They weren't cold anymore. They were warm, familiar, as if they had been waiting for her. Harris climbed into the front seat, muttering curses. "Don't touch anything unless I tell you. One wrong move and you'll get us killed." Sarah said nothing. The engine roared, rattling her bones, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't imagining. She wasn't dreaming. She was inside the fight. The Apache lifted into the desert night. The ground fell away. The horizon opened wide. And Sarah Collins, the quiet mechanic, was no longer on the outside looking in. 10 miles out, the convoy's location lit up the radio. Gunfire, screams, static. Harris pushed the Apache into a dive, skimming low over the sand. Sarah scanned the screens, her fingers flying across the systems panel. "Targets ahead. Bearing 095, she called out, her voice steady. Harris glanced back. Surprised, she sounded like she'd been doing it for years. Then they saw it. The road was a nightmare, burning trucks. Soldiers crouched behind smoking wreckage. Tracer fire streaking across the dark. Enemy fighters moved among the flames like shadows, pouring rounds into the pinned-down Americans. "Hang on," Harris growled, gripping the controls. The Apache swooped low, rockets streaking into the desert, detonating with earth-shaking thunder. Sarah's hands flew over the weapon system. She armed the chain gun, locked targets, called out enemy positions with precision. 3 o'clock, moving fast. Range 400. Got him. The chain gun roared, spitting fire. Enemy fighters scattered, some falling, others scrambling into the dark, but it wasn't over. Not even close. A plume of smoke erupted near the convoy, an RPG strike. One of the remaining trucks exploded, sending flames sky high. Over the radio, a desperate voice screamed, "We're getting overrun!" Sarah's chest tightened. She glanced at Harris. His jaw was tight, sweat dripping. For once, he didn't look cocky. He looked scared. She leaned forward, her voice sharp, commanding, "Swing left." "There, behind the ridge." "They've got another launcher." Harris hesitated. Then, without argument, he banked hard. Rockets streaked from the Apache's wings, blowing the ridge apart. Enemy fighters scattered like ants. For the first time, Harris looked back at her, not with contempt, but with shock. "You've done this before," he muttered. Sarah's eyes burned as she scanned for the next threat. "No," she said. "I just know what I'm capable of." The battle raged on, the Apache unleashing fury across the desert. Under their cover, the convoy survivors regrouped, dragging the wounded to safety. Every second mattered. Every call Sarah made meant lives saved. When the last enemy force broke and fled into the night, Harris pulled the Apache up. Silence filled the cockpit, broken only by the hum of the rotors. Below, soldiers cheered weakly, raising their rifles in salute as the Apache circled overhead. In that moment, Sarah Collins wasn't the quiet mechanic anymore. She was the reason they had lived, and Harris, who had mocked her, laughed at her, dismissed her, said nothing. He couldn't, because the truth was undeniable. The quiet mechanic had just flown into battle and changed everything. The desert was quiet again. Too quiet. The smoke of battle still hung in the air, drifting over the wreckage of burning trucks and scattered weapons. Sarah sat in the Apache's seat, her body buzzing with adrenaline, her hands still trembling from gripping the controls. They had done it. They had saved the convoy. But she knew in her heart it wasn't over. Back at base, the landing zone was lined with soldiers. Word had traveled fast. 2 Apaches had gone out. One had returned with both pilots shaken but alive. The other? It had carried someone no one expected, the quiet mechanic. Sarah climbed down from the cockpit, her boots crunching on the gravel. For a moment, there was silence. Then the cheering began. Soldiers clapped, whistled, some even saluted. They didn't see her as the grease-stained girl from the hangar anymore. They saw her as the woman who had flown into fire and brought brothers home. But not everyone was cheering. Captain Harris climbed down behind her, his face like stone. He walked straight to the colonel, shaking his head. "She got lucky," Harris snapped. "Don't let this go to her head. She doesn't belong up there." The colonel stared at him, then at Sarah. Finally he spoke, his voice steady. "Luck doesn't save a convoy. Skill does. And from what I've heard, Collins kept you alive tonight." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Harris's face darkened, but he said nothing. Sarah stood silent, her heart pounding. For the first time in years, she wasn't invisible. For the first time, people saw her. Over the next weeks, missions grew deadlier. The enemy was relentless. Convoys were hit, patrols ambushed, bases shelled. And each time, the Apaches were called to strike back. And each time, Sarah was there. The colonel made it official. She wasn't just a mechanic anymore. She was assigned as a co-pilot trainee, logging hours under fire, proving herself mission after mission. Harris never stopped grumbling, but even he couldn't deny her skill. There were nights when Sarah sat alone in the cockpit after missions, her hands resting on the controls. She thought about her father, about the words that had haunted her. Leave the fighting to men. If only he could see her now. Then came the day that would define everything. The base was hit, harder than ever before. Mortars rained down, explosions ripping through the perimeter. A massive force of fighters poured across the desert, determined to overrun them. It was chaos. Smoke, fire, the screams of wounded men. The Apaches were scrambled again. But this time, one of the pilots never made it to his bird. A direct hit had taken him before he reached the flight line. The colonel didn't hesitate. He pointed at Sarah. "You're flying lead tonight." The words hit her like thunder. She wasn't co-pilot. She wasn't backup. She was lead. Her legs felt like stone as she strapped in, but her voice was calm over the radio. "Apache 1 is airborne." The rotors thundered and she lifted into the night sky. The desert stretched below, burning with fire and gunpowder. The enemy force surged forward, hundreds strong. If they broke through, the base would fall. Sarah gritted her teeth. She wasn't just fighting for survival now. She was fighting for every soldier on the ground. The Apache screamed over the desert, missiles streaking, chain gun roaring. Enemy trucks exploded, fighters scattered. Harris flew alongside her in the second bird, his voice tense over comms. "Collins, watch your 6. RPG incoming!" She banked hard, the missile streaking past, exploding in the dunes. Her hands were steady, her breath sharp, her eyes locked on the battlefield. She moved the Apache like it was part of her, an extension of her will. Soldiers on the ground cheered as the Apaches tore through the enemy line. The attack crumbled. The base stood. And when Sarah brought her bird down at dawn, smoke still rising from the horizon, the colonel was waiting. He saluted her not out of formality, out of respect. "You were the difference tonight," he said. "Without you, we'd be counting bodies. You saved this base." Behind him, Harris stood silent. For once, there was no smirk, no cutting remark. He only nodded at her, his eyes carrying something she had never seen before. Respect. Months later, when Sarah returned home, the town gathered to welcome the unit back. Her father was there, standing in the crowd. He looked older, smaller than she remembered. For a long moment, they only stared at each other. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough. "I was wrong." Sarah swallowed hard, tears stinging her eyes. He reached out, touched her shoulder. "You didn't just fight, Sarah. You became the kind of soldier men like me could only dream of being." Years later, soldiers still told the story, about the convoy that had almost been wiped out, about the night the base nearly fell, about the woman they used to call the quiet mechanic. Nobody laughed at her anymore. Nobody doubted her, because when the war came, when lives hung in the balance, it wasn't arrogance, rank, or bravado that made the difference. It was Sarah Collins, who had once been overlooked, mocked, dismissed, taking the controls of an Apache and proving the truth, that heroes don't always start loud. Sometimes they begin as whispers in the shadows, until the world has no choice but to hear them roar.